Regulation to maintain normal pH. Excess acids or bases need to be neutralized in some way to protect cells. The body's ability to successfully regulate acid-base balance depends on the lungs, the kidneys, and on chemical buffers. Chemical buffering systems come into force to modify or neutralize any excesses. In other words, they are chemicals that help maintain normal body pH by neutralizing strong acids and bases. Then the kidneys and the lungs complete the process. A buffer is a substance that takes up or donates hydrogen ions as conditions change. In other words, it is any mechanism that resists changes in pH. A buffer combines with the offending acid or base to neutralize its harmful effects. Chemical buffers are most efficient pH balancers. However, they cannot compensate for large or sustained changes. Think of a buffer as a hydrogen sponge. The reaction between a sponge buffer and free hydrogen ion can go in either direction. It is reversible. Buffers are present in the extracellular, intracellular fluids, and in red blood cells. The hemoglobin. Either chemicals or proteins can be buffers. There are three major types of buffers. Bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer. That's primarily an extracellular fluid buffer. It is a chemical buffer. Protein buffering system, most powerful intracellular fluid buffer. It is the most common protein buffer. And the phosphate buffering system, predominantly intracellular and urinary. It is also a chemical buffer. Well, how quickly do you think these buffers act? They act immediately. Thus, they are referred to as the most efficient. The bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer accounts for over 50% of all chemical buffering. Sodium bicarbonate, NaHCO3, is a weak but important buffer because it facilitates the conversion of a strong acid like hydrogen to a weaker acid like carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is now a volatile acid that can be eliminated via the lungs in a way of carbon dioxide. In other words, bicarb turns acids into something that is not harmful to the body. Remember, it is the primary buffer in the extracellular fluid, and it is also important to know that the pH is maintained in a 20:1 ratio of bicarb to carbonic acid. We can give sodium bicarb intravenously in emergencies, such as in metabolic acidosis with cardiac arrest. Please, there is no need for you to memorize this slide. It only shows how a strong acid, like hydrochloric acid, can combine with sodium bicarb to form carbonic acid plus sodium chloride and now be buffered. A base, such as a sodium hydroxide plus carbonic acid, leads to, or vice versa, sodium bicarb plus water. Now, back to the weak but important bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer. Let's start with the hydrogen ions and the bicarb. Bicarb facilitates the conversion of a strong acid, like hydrogen ions, to weaker acid, like carbonic acid. But where does the bicarb come from? The kidneys is what helps with the buffer system because they can regulate the production of the bicarb. Just keep in mind that adequate renal function is necessary to produce the bicarbonate. Bicarb is generated and reabsorbed in order to maintain sufficient body stores. As you see, there are double arrows between the chemical reactions, just like you learned in chemistry, so that regulation can take place either way. And what helps regulation of carbonic acid? The lungs. Now, carbonic acid, which is volatile acid, meaning that it can change readily into a vapor, can now be eliminated via the lungs as carbon dioxide. We will think of carbon dioxide as an acid. Now we don't have the extra free hydrogen ions. Now keep in mind, amounts can vary as long as the 20:1 ratio remains in the normal range, right? Now we move on to talk about the primary intracellular buffer, meaning balance will be kept between acid and base within the cells. Remember, 85% of phosphate is in the bones, 14% is intracellular and in the renal tubular fluid, and more than the 1% extracellular in blood plasma. So phosphate acts predominantly as an intracellular fluid and a urinary buffer. This buffer system consists of dihydrogen phosphate ions, H2PO4, which is a hydrogen ion donor, therefore the acid, and hydrogen phosphate ions, HPO4, as hydrogen ion acceptor, therefore the base. These two ions are in equilibrium with each other. If additional hydrogen ions enter the cellular fluid, they are consumed in the reaction with HPO4 and the equilibrium shifts to the left. If additional hydroxide ions enter the cellular fluid, they react with H2PO4, producing HPO4 and shifting the equilibrium to the right. Are you with me? Hello? All I'm saying is I won't be able to get you to understand the exact whys and hows, but know that it's a buffer. Guys, that's a hint for you not to ask me any chemistry questions. This buffer responds to small fluctuations in pH and responds quickly. Again, buffering primarily occurs in renal tubules, moving hydrogen ions from plasma to urine to eliminate the acid. Let's just move on to the protein buffering system. Amino acids, the building blocks of protein, can accept or donate hydrogen ions. They make excellent buffers. Any protein has hundreds of amino acids, so they make buffer superb. The carboxyl group, over here guys, follow the cursor. At a neutral pH, this is only the COO. But mixed with an acid, this carboxyl accepts a hydrogen. Now, on the right, the amino group at a neutral pH is really nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. But if the protein finds itself in an alkaline environment, it will release a hydrogen. Interesting, huh? Again, don't test me in chemistry. Just know that the protein buffering system works. And where are most proteins found? In the intracellular fluid, right? Well, we know that albumin and globulin are in the extracellular fluid, and they too can buffer. But the buffer is more powerful in the intracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid proteins provide extensive buffering for organic acids produced by cellular metabolism. When hydrogen ion concentrations increase in the blood, the hydrogen crosses the red blood cell's membrane and enters the cell, displacing intracellular electrolytes. The hemoglobin buffers the hydrogen ions directly, resulting in decreased hydrogen ions in the blood, and thus bringing pH up again. Also recall that hemoglobin protein can reversibly bind either hydrogen ions to the protein or oxygen to the iron of the heme group, but that when one of these substances is bound, the other is released. What am I saying? I'm saying that the oxygen carrying capacity may be reduced. This is good during exercise, for example, as hemoglobin helps to control the pH of the blood by binding some of the excess proteins that are generated in the muscles. At the same time, molecular oxygen is released for use by the muscles. Do you remember what I said about the respiratory system regulating carbonic acid in the body by eliminating or retaining carbon dioxide? Okay, let's elaborate on this type of pH regulation. It is powerful for eliminating volatile acids. This is the exhalation of carbon dioxide. It only works with volatile acids, not with fixed acids like lactic acid. This respiratory response is rapid, within minutes, and initially very effective. So how does it happen? Chemoreceptors in the brain's medulla sense a change in pH. Let me explain. The carbon dioxide diffuses passively from the blood into the cerebrospinal fluid, changing its pH. This activates the respiratory center to modify the rate and depth of breathing in order to compensate. Wow! Is there a catch? Yes, it depends on adequate stores of bicarbonate and adequate gas exchange. So, to summarize, respiratory regulation of pH occurs via both the carbonic acid buffering pathways and the respiratory system. So, if body pH can be adjusted by changing the rate and depth of breathing, when does this start? Because the chemical buffers can't keep up with the changes, right? Well, when the PaCO2 is increased, meaning the pH is low, right? The respiratory rate increases to blow off carbon dioxide. And when PaCO2 is decreased and pH is increased, the respiratory rate decreases to retain CO2. Keep in mind that the respiratory system of an older adult may be compromised and less able to regulate acid-base balance. It is important to note that this respiratory control mechanism will only be effective if the neurologically intact person, right? The unconscious, sedated, or head injured are at risk of carbon dioxide accumulation. The lungs can restore normal pH only temporarily. Long-term adjustments to pH are accomplished by the kidneys, and we will continue with that. The renal system is responsible for long-term regulation of acid-base balance. The kidneys, however, take much longer to compensate, sometimes as long as 3 to 5 days to fully compensate. The kidneys eliminate large amounts of non-volatile acids that are produced during metabolism. So how is an increase or decrease of hydrogen ions corrected? The kidneys excrete or reabsorb bicarb, and they selectively excrete or retain hydrogen ions. For example, an increase in hydrogen ion concentration is corrected by increasing the amount of bicarbonate that is returned to the blood, and a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration is corrected by increasing the amount of acid that is returned to the blood while increasing the amount of bicarbonate excretion. Other kidney involvement is with the excretion and reabsorption of PO4 or phosphate and ammonia. Hydrogen follows PO4 and ammonia. The kidneys may be slower to compensate, 24 to 48 hours in healthy kidneys, and up to 2 to 5 days otherwise, but they are much more powerful, and they can return the pH of up to a perfectly normal 7.4. Remember that the kidneys maintain consistent levels of plasma electrolytes, including bicarbonate. So if the kidneys fail, pH balance fails. Buffers, lungs, kidneys control pH. So what are the rates of correction? Only the kidneys can expel hydrogen ion from the body. Other buffering systems only reduce hydrogen by binding it to another chemical. Chemical buffers function almost instantaneously. Respiratory mechanisms take several minutes to hours, and renal mechanisms may take several hours to days. But the kidneys can neutralize more acid or base than both chemical and respiratory buffers. Renal tubules secrete hydrogen ion into tubular fluid, where most combines with bicarb, ammonia, and phosphate buffers. Bound and free hydrogen ions are then excreted in the urine. Let's review. In an acidotic state, acid can be excreted and bicarb can be produced, right? Right. Okay, and in an alkaline state, bicarb can be excreted and hydrogen can be produced, right? Good, I'm glad you agree. So the first line of defense against a pH shift are the chemical buffers. Those include the bicarbonate, the phosphate, and the protein buffer systems. The second line of defense against a pH shift are the physiological buffers, referring to the respiratory mechanisms to excrete carbon dioxide and the renal mechanism to excrete hydrogen. Yeah, we got it. We can move on then. Now let's talk about the acid-base imbalance themselves.